So especially for those who have own multiple businesses, this is something we're pretty concerned about. All that flows through to the owner's individual tax return, and be thousands of small businesses that would be negatively impacted by this. Okay, so both of these issues are up. The first step is language has to be approved at the state, at this group that's called the Board of Canvassers. There are four gubernatorial appointees, two Republicans, two Democrats. That's how it works. And the law is set up that way. The governor, regardless of party, must nominate people that the parties put forward in terms of a short list of here are some Republicans to choose from, here are some Democrats to choose from. That group of four must agree on both the petition form, the petition language, and 100-word description of the proposal. And so SBAM will be engaging in this process because both of these proposals that we find quite harmful to small businesses, the suggested language by proponents of it and the 100-word description is extremely biased. And so this is the sort of thing that we do for our members is that we watch and watch the system, we engage in the system on your behalf. If there's going to be an effort to increase taxes on successful small businesses, then we believe that the description that voters see should say that. And so we're going to engage in that process. Oftentimes, people don't even hear about these proposals until after the signatures are collected and it appears on the ballot. At that point, the words are set. And if there are biases that are built into the descriptions, those carry through. Voters are trusting in this sense. If they see the words on there, they assume it must be true. And so anyway, this is the process that we're engaging in over the next few weeks with the hope that if these things do make the ballot, that the descriptions will be fair and accurate and not paint small business owners as villains, which really the wording as they have it today makes it seem as though, or it suggests that if you're a successful small business owner, that essentially you're evading taxes. That's it's just part of the service that we provide to our members, and this is one that doesn't come up all that often, but we're engaging in and heavily engaged in, and we'll see this one through till the end.
All right, so our neighbor to the south is also contemplating a change in income tax policy. What is Ohio up to?
Yeah, Ohio is going literally the opposite direction. It's passed the Senate now, so not into law, but to eliminate their graduated tax. They have two tax rates, and basically theirs is 2.75% and 3.5%. So ironically, both of their tax rates are below Michigan's rate. So even if you're at the higher rate down in Ohio, your tax rate is lower on the individual tax return, which again, for most small businesses, that's where they pay their business tax. But the proposal there would be to, and that threshold starts at 100,000. It would be to eliminate the 3.5% bracket and have everybody be at 2.75%. Small business owners in Ohio would be huge winners in that type of a change. So when there are forces here in Michigan that are going the direction of making, get this, the top tax rate of Michigan would go to 9.25%, and that would go up against, if Ohio is successful here, Ohio at 2.75%. That's a pretty dramatic difference. This isn't like somebody having to go to Florida for a much advantageous rate. Even just our neighbor directly to the south would have quite a competitive advantage over Michigan.
All right, let's bring up some good news now, Brian. And this is good news out of the U.S. Department of Labor about rules pertaining to independent contractors. What can you tell us?
A year ago, we had shared with you, and we've talked about it many times since then, the U.S. Department of Labor implemented a new six-part test. They called it the economic realities test. That was very subjective, that made it more difficult to legally qualify as an independent contractor or to pay somebody as an independent contractor on a 1099 instead of a W-2 as an employee. Those rules really, even though they went into place, they were really never forcefully um, um, applied across the board. The regulators never really implemented them. So the rule got made and it's in effect, and yet it really there was no real effort to enforce that regulation. The but it's still in place, and so is a risk. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, the good news is that even if you didn't review and maybe you've been out of compliance, now the new Department of Labor has said we're going to pull back on that rule. So we are, in other words, not going to enforce the rule. They referred back to a previous bulletin from the department saying, here's what we're going to enforce. Now there is this would be, I think, the pretext of repealing the rule from last year and going formally back to the pre-spring of 2024 rules. I think this is the pretext for that happening, but it hasn't happened yet. So there is still some risk of a private right of action where if somebody maybe wants to be an employee, but you're paying them the 1099, that they could challenge it on their own behalf, like in court. But in terms of the regulators saying, hey, you're not doing your independent contractor classifications correctly according to this rule, that um, there's a very, I think, very direct statement that they're just not going to enforce this new rule. And I thought it provided some comfort that they pointed back to a previous bulletin. So again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you got lucky that maybe you didn't make changes to comply with it, but now the previous rules are going back into effect. We're going to do some communication on this, some more details about it here in the coming weeks, to make sure that you know what the previous rules were. And just this is the sort of thing where if you got them as an independent contractor, and really under the rules, even the old rules, they should be an employee, and the person is spending more than 40 hours a week, then there are some ways there's some pretty serious violations there. So we want to make sure you're still doing it right. But the rules are going back to the objective rules before, where it's pretty straightforward. Do this, this, and this, and you know that you're in compliance. We like those objective rules. So stay tuned. We'll have more on this independent contractors reverting back to the pre-Biden administration rule set.
All right. So, Brian, let's talk about some risks that are starting to stack up here at the state level. Can you share your top concerns?
Yeah, actually, I'll stick first with independent contractors. So we were talking about the U.S. Department of Labor's independent contractor rules, but states can also have their own rules on these things. Michigan does not right now. The state simply enforces the federal rules. But like in California, for example, they have their own independent contractor rules. Those are still in effect, even with the U.S. Department of Labor changing. At the state here, there is an ongoing effort. It has been reintroduced, legislation has been reintroduced in the Senate to uh, essentially codify the rules that the U.S. Department of Labor is moving away from now, to put those in state law. So obviously we need to oppose that. There's another one that the proponents like to call polluter pay. And I hate that title because it's very misleading. We already have polluter pay in Michigan. If you are a property owner and you pollute your property, you are liable for that. What this legislation actually does is it says that if you own a piece of property that somebody in the past has polluted, that wasn't you, a previous owner, this legislation would break that kind of protection that you have in being liable for that damage. So this would really, if that were to pass, I think that you would find a lot of orphan properties out of there that nobody would ever want to own, and to do some put back in circulation or to try to clean up, because that chain of responsibility that gets broken under current law, they say that even if you're not the polluter, you still have to pay, or there's a risk of that. Very, very concerning and moving backward. So fewer polluted properties would get cleaned up under this law that they call polluter pay. The Consumer Protection Act expansion, another one that has been introduced, actually passed out of the Senate and is headed over to the House. We feel pretty comfortable it's not going to pass in the House, but still something we're on guard with. Consumer Protection Act is something where if a business does something, some sort of problem with a product or maybe misrepresentation, under the Consumer Protection Act, there's a process you can follow. The exceptions to that are those professions that have their own supervisory boards in state government. So it could be through licensing controls that if you have a problem with somebody in a certain profession, you go to that licensing board. You don't go through the Consumer Protection Act. Unfortunately, there's an effort, and there's literally dozens of professions and types of businesses that today they're regulated and the public is protected through one system, and that system is separate from the Consumer Protection Act. This proposal is running through that ran through the Senate would say no, those businesses that have separate boards that protect the consumer, they would just be subject to two different systems. So you'd have to comply with both Consumer Protection Act and the separate system, which obviously is not fair for those businesses. They should only have one system they have to comply with. And then there's data breach and data privacy legislation that got introduced as well that has penalty notification and notification requirements that we think would be difficult for many small businesses to comply with if they were to ever get hacked. And so the thing that we want to make sure is that these are important issues, but we want to make sure that when a small business gets hacked, that they're treated like victims, not like criminals. And our concern with this legislation is that it turns the table on the small businesses that got hacked. It puts them on the defensive, treats them like the criminal instead of the victim. And so we have big concerns with that legislation too. So it's just some of the things that are popped up, some of the same issues that we were worried about last term, particularly active in the state Senate. So we are hard at work. We'll keep you up to date and actually just kind of reintroducing our list. I think we had like a top 10 list last term that we tried to keep pretty fresh of. Here are our main concerns of things that could run through the process. And those are starting to stack up. I think we might need to bring our top 10 list back.
We'll work on that, getting that up to date. But a reminder too, if you subscribe to our Watchdog newsletter, you'll get updates every week on what's going on in the legislature. All right, so Brian, a couple of weeks ago, we had a guest from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan on talking about affordability. And Blue Cross continues to take actions to reduce administrative costs as small businesses struggle over increasing costs of providing health insurance. We did a survey on this issue last month, and you've been doing a lot of media on those results. So can you kind of summarize the landscape for our viewers?
Yeah, this is something it just seems like of all the issues out there that are really important to small business owners, this is the one that there's the least amount of conversation kind of in the public sphere and in public policy. We're really trying to elevate this. And when we see things that are incongruent with the interests of small business owners, we like to point them out. And this is one of those areas where rising costs of health insurance and providing that benefit to employees is getting more and more difficult. Small business owners buckling under the weight of this. So we've talked about rising pharmaceutical costs. We've talked about rising hospitalization costs. There's a report that I think will be coming out pretty soon that people will find enlightening about margins in the industry and the way that is kind of feeding into these year-over-year double-digit increases. Now, Blue Cross Blue Shield has taken a handful of steps. They get a new CEO and continue to control the part that they really can control the most, which is their own administrative expense. And so I just wanted to point out, because we point out when there's problems, I want to point out when somebody's doing the right thing. And in this case, they'd announced that, there's a lot changing in the business world and efficiency and how many people are needed to run an operation. But they offered and have now eliminated 500 positions through buyouts. So then another 600 positions being eliminated. That is a combination of things. Some of it happened through attrition. They are the goal is to trim $285 million in administrative costs by the end of this year, which is even for a big company like Blue Cross, it's a big number, but it impacts the amount that ends up working into the rates of small businesses, which is important because there was a $1.7 billion underwriting loss in their pool last year. In other words, the claims paid out were 1.7 billion more than the premiums that were charged. And we had shared before that they had made some other changes. They've actually eliminated now a total of 1,370 positions, including employees and retirements and independent contractors within that system. So a large amount of overall administrative expense being reduced out of it. So we're thankful for this. We know, though, that it's the claims experience that's driving most of the increase. But I just wanted to point out because it seems like there's very few people in the healthcare that are in the healthcare system that are taking aggressive actions to reduce costs. So we see that happening here. Just wanted to call it out.
All right, well, thanks for that update. Let's switch topics here and talk about tariffs. Obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth on tariffs these past few months. But Brian, do we know if there is a trade deal with China and what's still on the table in that relationship?
Yeah, I wanted to dig into this one a little bit because there was some talk like there's a deal with China. You saw some response, like in the overall in the stock markets, both in the U.S. and in China, um, about this. And I would say at this point, it's more like a framework agreement, like a handshake deal, that still has a few important elements that need to be ironed out. Ironically, the tariff amounts appear to be not the thing that needs to be ironed out. It's other controls and limitations that the Chinese government is imposing on certain things. So here's where things stand. The U.S. will impose there's three types of tariffs, a total of 55% tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S. China will impose a 10% tariff on US goods being sold into China. It's so much cheaper to make things in China that a 10% tariff on US goods being imported actually probably will not change the landscape in terms of what's most affordable in China. But the amount coming back this way, again, ironically, 55%, it will make some impact, um, but in many industries, somebody paying the tariff, and it'll be shared across, essentially multiple different parties, um, that 55% probably will not significantly reduce the number of things being imported from China. So what that means is that it will be a new revenue source to the U.S. federal government, but because the tariffs will get paid, and Chinese trade will still happen. This is a level where this agreement was reached because it's at a level where the dynamic of the trade, ironically, these numbers sound pretty big, but ironically, the dynamic of the lion's share of the trade will not substantially change. And so that's the amount. Those, from my understanding, are generally agreed to. It's the rare earth minerals and magnets that essentially China has agreed to 6-month rolling agreements on the willingness to sell them out of China into the U.S. And this is the sticking point because while China says, well, we don't want to go any further than 6 months because there's a lot of demand around the world and we have to control for that. And we can't promise any further than that. The US sees it as leverage. So as long as they avoid a long-term deal, that's a lot of lever on those rare minerals, but especially the rare earth magnets. It gives them always or never more than 6 months away from an opportunity to apply leverage in their relationship with the United States.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about rare earth magnets and why they are such an important factor.
Yeah, this is a rare earth magnets are it's something that it's like we've all heard minerals and we know about like batteries and lithium and the thing, you hear these words and you know that the world has changed quite a bit. And so I made some notes here on like the applications of rare earth magnets that so many come out of China. And it's not just manufacturing, but literally taking them out of the ground. So it's powering electric vehicle motors. Okay, so there's a ton of action around the world on that. Wind turbine generators. How about this one in every single workplace and home? Computer hard drives. So pretty big medical imaging devices, things like MRI machines require this. Virtually all consumer electronics these days, including smartphones. The it's or something as simple. I mean, it's not even like sophisticated stuff like headphones that require these, and then defense systems. And this is where there's some national security concern. Um, Missile guidance systems, radar, satellite communications. So you get a sense for modern life is so dependent on these. And that's why it was kind of interesting that there was a pretty quick and it's relatively easy agreement on tariff rates. But when it comes to a long-term agreement on access to rare earth magnets, very different landscape and one that there isn't really, it's not settled yet.
All right, one more story before Data Monday, Brian. Can we check in with the autos? How are they doing these days?
Yeah, there's a lot of transition that's happening within the automotive companies, and I normally stick to the two, our two domestics, Ford and General Motors. So Ford had sales gains as like there's just a ton of buying activity in the first part of the year. So buying up now, avoid the possibility of future tariffs being worked into the prices. So it will be interesting to see whether or not that takes a bite out of sales for the future. But a year over year, 16.3% gain in their monthly sales. Um, was uh, was was pretty big. On the General Motors front, it was oh, and by the way, but they are making some transitions. There's been some statements about the viability of the scope of that big battery plant in Marshall, Michigan, that's under construction. So it's not clear to me whether they'd be considering repurposing or it's just a matter of productivity, how much they have to scale or what the demand will be there. General Motors announced that they actually on Orion Assembly plant in Oakland Township. That was one of the ones that got a big state incentive for a transition to electric vehicles, but they're actually switching back to gas-powered vehicles as part of a $4 billion plan to increase manufacturing in the U.S. over the next couple of years. Essentially, what they're talking about is some of there's just profit margin in this type of vehicle, and so some of the vehicles that sell here really well in the US but are made in Mexico um, will be production moved there to and probably Canada too, but especially Mexico to Orion Township. So big transitions and changes that are happening in the automotive industry. I think really what they need is for everything to settle, and then they'll figure out where productivity and production has to happen, and what the product mix will be. But I would expect additional big kind of shifts and swings until the policies here settle permanently.
Okay, let's close out today's show with a Data Monday report.
All right, most of today's report is on inflation, which, like last month, pretty good report today. So you see the consumer price index, both the headline or the overall, inflation along with um, the core inflation, which takes out the commodities of food and energy. So 2.8 and 2.4% respectively. So they've been kind of hanging out in that area for a while. The concern, of course, was that they might spike with all that's happening with tariffs, but those things are kind of settling. And even with the tariffs, remember the concern there was whether or not there'd be supply chain disruptions and shortages that would cause price increases. Um, Tariffs might increase costs, but it's a one-time adjustment, so it's not ongoing inflation. So, which just kind of an academic difference, but a difference because we're following this with respect to impact on interest rates. When we look at what is happening month over month, the with the CPI, you'll see that the headline and the core both moved up 0.1% month over month. So again, pretty welcome range for those to be in, and feels like the continued case for easing up on the monetary controls and the interest rates is called for. The so we've got another that looks at services and goods. And as you see, the price of goods had actually fallen into deflationary territory for a little while, but now back, 0.3%. And then, but the service inflation's continuing to come down. And then we've got just the food component. You'll see the food hanging around 3%, had been very, very high. Obviously, there's components of food that are much higher than this, but the overall little higher, but not, again, not the type of things that people maybe a couple months ago were pretty concerned about. Looking at the month over month by category changes, you'll see, not surprisingly, there at the biggest deflation area is gasoline and airfare. But then at the top of the list, you'll see electricity and fuel oil still up there. So you see different types of energy on different, the extremes of these lists, and then year over year. You'll see natural gas is one that's gone up quite a bit, and motor vehicle insurance. We're hearing more and more about property and casualty insurance increases, cancellations than we ever have. And then you see at the bottom of the list, gasoline, fuel oil, airfare, same as the month over month numbers in deflationary territory. Now, out of inflation for a moment, this is the National Federation of Independent Business National Monthly Survey. And I thought it was really interesting that they added on this. It was availability of labor as that fourth factor. Now it's cost and availability of insurance. They've added in there because that has been on the rise. And so the top four answers in their survey, you see taxes actually has kind of come up to a higher level, and I suspect that's because some small businesses are going to pay more in terms of tariffs to get goods in the into that is a tax to them. So you definitely see taxes on the rise of concerns. That's barely number one now. Whereas quality of labor, which had been number one, is now number two. And then inflation, the concerns around inflation actually continuing to come down. And then the cost or availability of insurance going up. And then the final slide here, U.S. labor force participation rate for that core, the middle of the labor pool, 25 to age 54, and pretty steady. The was down a little bit, but generally hanging out at that 83.5%, and has been in that range now for really for a couple of years. So I'd say all in all, from an inflation standpoint, pretty good. I think it's going to be more and more difficult for the Federal Reserve to justify higher interest rates. The longer, I mean, we have had such a prolonged period of time between 2 and 3% that, yeah, it's not below 2% or it's not at the 2% target. But the borrowing costs and the economic threats, I think more and more people are coming to the conclusion that those are bigger risks to our economy than inflation.
All right, well, thanks, Brian, for that report, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We do have a few webinars scheduled. One is another ESTA primer next week, amongst a few others. So I encourage you to visit sbam.org/events to check those out. Hopefully we'll be seeing some of you at tomorrow's annual meeting. Otherwise, we'll be back here next Monday at 3 o'clock. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.